Hello, I'm Scott Ortman. Thanks for tuning in. Today I'd like to share with you all some information about the work I've been doing with the Pueblo of Pojoaque and with people from other Tewa villages and also students at the University of Colorado and young people from the Pueblo for the past 6 years, starting in 2014 and continuing still today. Back in 2014, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Pueblo, Bruce Bernstein, approached me about the idea of developing a heritage program for the Pueblo that would include archaeology as part of the effort. And as Bruce and I talked together and incorporated ideas from the community members as to what the community was hoping the project would look like, these were the goals that we ended up developing for our work together. What we wanted to do first was to help increase the community's awareness of the ancestral sites on Pojoaque land today, and through that process to help strengthen the historical consciousness of community members. In my talk today, I'll be sharing a little bit about the history of the Pueblo. And something that you'll see is that the community has had several episodes in its history where the community members have dispersed away from the Pueblo and then come back again. And because of those repeated cycles of dispersal and coming back together, awareness of the ancestral places in the Pueblo is not as widely shared among community members as everyone hopes it would be today. So a key goal of our project together was to encourage greater historical consciousness among tribal members. We also wanted to give community members some exposure to what contemporary archaeology is like. Archaeology, I've heard many community members say that, from a tribal perspective, archaeology is a four-letter word. And I think there are good reasons why archaeology has been perceived that way in tribal communities. So what we wanted to do was to work together to try and present a way of doing archaeology in a tribal context that would be of value to the community and not just, of value to non-native archaeologists and the public. We also wanted the program to provide informal STEM education for tribal members to help perhaps give community members ideas about ways that STEM concepts can be used to better the Pueblo for the future, and perhaps to help spur the imaginations of tribal members regarding careers involving in STEM fields that could help with the Pueblo. Another important goal was to integrate traditional knowledge of Pojoaque and other Tewa community members with archaeological evidence. What we wanted to do was to put those two forms of knowledge into dialogue with each other. One way of thinking about it would be, well, if archaeology by itself or traditional knowledge by itself tells you everything that there is to know about history, then there's really no point in working together. The point in working together is to put those two bodies of knowledge together to learn things that we don't already know. And I hope to show you some examples of how we've put those two bodies of knowledge together in our work to expand knowledge of Pojoaque history. And finally, what we wanted to do was to promote what we call a partnership model of doing archaeology in tribal communities. And I've come to feel that the idea of partnership is a little bit better than the concept of collaboration, for example, because I really do view what we're doing together as co-investigation, where community members and non-native visitors, archaeologists, students, each have their own things that they're interested in about the past. And the different communities involved in our work have different questions that they want answered. And what we're hoping to do is promote a way of thinking where there's not one answer necessarily. There are more, let's say it focuses more on interesting conversations than on final answers to the questions that we have. So the methods that we've been using in this work include mapping with unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, We've done intensive documentation of the surface remains of ancestral sites in the Pojoaque area. We've also spent a lot of time reanalyzing collections in museums from past excavations at sites in the area. As I mentioned previously, we've really focused on a co-investigation model of what we're doing. So, our goal is to bring information about the observations of the archaeological record, information about the archaeological record to community members for them to consider and think about and contribute to. And also for community members to be a part of our field teams and our laboratory teams and to share what they think is important about what we're seeing and observing, and to encourage the archaeologists on the team to adjust the way they work to take those reactions and perceptions into account. In the last few years, we've also started a soil sampling program where we've collected environmental samples out of deposits that are eroding out of the sides of terraces. One of my students, Caitlin Davis, is also using a core sampler to collect archaeobotanical samples from ancestral field areas around several villages. And also we are doing several analyses that involve chemical analysis of selected objects, either in existing collections or of new objects we temporarily collect from the field. Here's a map to orient you all to the area where I'm talking about. The area where the Pueblo of Pojoaque is located is in northern New Mexico. It's often referred to by community members as the Tewa Basin today. You can see the map of the United States with the location of the Tewa Basin marked. The Pueblo of Pojoaque is right in the center of an area where there are tribal lands for 6 different Tewa-speaking villages. You can see those on the map in the upper right. One of the key villages that we'll be discussing is Kuyamuge, and that's the village that is marked with the triangle on the map there in the upper right. On the left, you can see a blow-up of the Pueblo of Pojoaque's tribal lands, and also present-day inholdings within the Pueblo that are in purple there. The story behind all those inholdings is a long and somewhat sordid tale that's probably best for another time. But you can see labeled here several of the ancestral sites that we have investigated and documented over the past 6 years. And I'll be talking especially about Kuyamuge at the south end of Pojoaque land, which is actually privately owned today, and it's owned by an organization called the Kuyamuge Institute, who has been very gracious in giving us permission to do this work on their lands. I'll also be speaking a little bit about the Pojoaque Grant site, which you can see a little ways north of Kuyamuge on Pojoaque land. And I'll also be speaking about ancestral remains or ancestral sites within the Pueblo of Pojoaque itself, which you see a few kilometers north of Kuyamuge in the center of Pojoaque land. This year I am a resident scholar at the School for Advanced Research, and I'm working on a specific project related to our work together, and this is a summary of what I'm trying to do this year. The first thing I am hoping to do is to produce a book on the kind of material I'm presenting to you today that discusses our work, but also includes the voices of Pojoaque community members in the representation and in the results of our work, so that it's not just the archaeologists talking about the things that we've learned together or speaking for community members. What I really hope is that this book will include community members' voices in the text. And what I want the book to contain what I want it to do is to share what I think is most important about our findings. Exactly what is the most important thing, of course, is always open to negotiation and discussion. Today I'll be presenting some things that I think seem important to me based on the discussions I've had with community members and on the relationships I've developed with community members over the years. But in sharing this with you all, I'm not at all trying to suggest that I know what's most important. These are just some observations that I have that I hope will continue to evolve in discussion with community members. In fact, I've invited members of the Pojoaque community to view this video, and since it's going to be posted on YouTube, there'll be plenty of opportunities for people to do that. So I'd like to think about this as an initial discussion regarding the direction this book could take. And as I mentioned previously, I'm really hoping that this book can place archaeology and traditional knowledge of Tewa communities into dialogue so that we can learn new things by putting those two bodies of knowledge together. So what I'd like to do with the rest of this presentation is share a few of the things that we've learned by working together at ancestral sites that seem to me to be important, and that they resonate with me based on my experiences visiting these ancestral places and my experiences spending time with community members at them. As I said previously, I wouldn't presume that these are the most important things, but these are things that struck me, let's say, as we've been working together. So you can see on the slide here, there are four main topics I'd like to share with you all. The first one is connections. The second is cycles. The third is about continuities and changes. And the fourth is about place and belonging. So I'll discuss the connections dimension of the things that we've learned first. So the Pueblo of Pojoaque, for those who travel through northern New Mexico today, will recognize immediately that the Pueblo is pretty connected to the larger world relative to some other Pueblo villages, because it's located right next to a major thoroughfare that heads from Santa Fe toward Taos, Highway 285. It's at the crossroads of the highway that goes up to Los Alamos to the west. And so it's a place that lots of people pass through today. Something that strikes me from the work we've been doing together is that that's been happening for a long time, and that the Pueblo community in Pojoaque has incorporated people from many different places into itself for a very long time. So this is one example of some evidence of that. The map you see here is of a site called the Pojoaque Grant Site. It's the oldest large village in the northern Rio Grande region of New Mexico. It was established around 900 AD. It's just a short distance south of the present-day Pueblo of Pojoaque. It consists of a number of family residences, which are shown in yellow here on the slide, arranged around a small butte, which you can see as the blue shading in the upper left of the map. Portions of this very old Pueblo were excavated by Stanley Stubbs in 1952, and as part of our project, students and I and volunteers at CU Boulder reanalyzed the collections from those excavations. And we found something very interesting when we looked at the material. But before I get into that, I want to draw your attention to the graph in the upper left corner of the slide. I'll show you several of these in the talk today. This is the output of a computer program that what we do is we feed the mix of different kinds of pottery that we've observed either in a museum collection or from tabulating potsherds laying around on the ground today. We feed all of that information into the computer program, and it outputs a graph where the height of the bar shows you the relative intensity of occupation of a place at different time slices in the past. So on the chart, there's other little lines in the chart that have to do with the method involved that you don't need to worry about. But the height of the gray bars is the key thing to look at. That's the result of the analysis. So what you can see looking at this particular graph is that it suggests that the Pojoaque Grant Site was established around 900 AD, and it grew pretty substantially during the 900s and through the 1000s. And then about 1100 AD, the population began to decline. There were a few people around in the 1200s, but by 1300, this village was basically vacated. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that you all can see that. Now, what's so interesting that we found by re-examining the collection? Much of the pottery in the collection consists of white-slipped serving vessels with a black mineral paint used to create the designs. And also it consists of gray cooking pottery that is smooth around the lower half of the vessel and has a series of bands where the coils of the clay have been left unobliterated around the neck and rim of the vessel. These kinds of pottery were the typical kinds of pottery made by Pueblo people that lived throughout the San Juan drainage to the north and west of Pojoaque, up in the region toward Chaco Canyon, heading north into southern Colorado. It's most of the pottery from this village, shows affinities with those regions. In previous research that I've done, I've suggested that the Tanoan languages that include the Tewa language originated up in the Four Corners country of southern Colorado primarily. And so the results of our reanalysis, are consistent with that idea. One of my students, Zachary Cooper, is doing a dissertation project on this village, so I expect we'll learn much more about it in the coming years. And this village has been studied by many other archaeologists, so there's much more that could be said about it than I'm able to say here. But I think the idea that this initial Puebloan community in the Pojoaque area has ties to the distant north is something that comes through in the analysis that we've done. But another thing we found that's kind of interesting is that a subset of the cooking pottery is a gray-based pottery that has striations in it, made perhaps using a cord or something like that, or maybe a corn cob or something rough that creates little striations over the surface of the vessel. This way of making cooking pottery is not typical at all of the San Juan area to the north and west of the Rio Grande and in the Four Corners area. In fact, this kind of pottery doesn't occur there at all. But it does occur in points north along the Rio Grande up toward the area around Taos, and also into southern Colorado around Raton and Trinidad, and in areas to the north and east from there out onto the southern plains. Perhaps this kind of pottery suggests that some ancestors of today's Apache people might have lived in the Pojoaque area and been part of this community more than 1,000 years ago. I say that because this style of pottery is something that's very prominent in ancestral Apachean communities of the southern plains. So there's an interesting affinity there. Finally, we also found some pieces of pottery that are of a polished brown ware. Rather than a gray clay or a white slip clay, it's a brown clay made in a reducing atmosphere. And it's the kind of pottery that is more common quite a ways to the south and to the southwest from the northern Rio Grande. So areas toward Socorro, New Mexico, and also then points east, maybe areas toward the Upper Gila Mountains, near in central New Mexico. Potentially, these are ancestral areas for today's Zuni people. And so it's possible also that perhaps some people whose descendants now live in Zuni Pueblo were also a part of the community at the Pojoaque Grant site. So even here, 1,000 years ago, Pojoaque seems to have been a crossroads where people from different parts of the world came together to create communities. I'll share with you a second example of this idea that's based on our work at Kuyamuge. But I want to introduce this pueblo a little bit first before we get into the archaeology of it. Kuyamuge is an important ancestral Tewa village and whose name is remembered and about which stories are remembered today. I've spoken with many Tewa people about the name Kuyamuge, and the most common interpretation I've heard many, don't get me wrong, there's many interpretations of this name, but the most common interpretation I've heard from the people I've talked to is that it's referring to an area across Tesuque Creek in the vicinity where you can see large boulders coming down the sides of a bench above the Tesuque Creek. And this is an image of the area that people point to when they say Kuyamuge, the place where the stones are falling down. The village was inhabited at the time that the Spaniards came into New Mexico, and this village is mentioned in several places in historical records from the time. It's mentioned as a visita of the Pueblo of Nambe in 1641. The inhabitants of Kuyamuge participated in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. During the so-called bloodless reconquest, de Vargas baptized 30 children there. Whether the children wanted to be baptized or not is not stated in the records, but the baptism occurred, according to de Vargas, on September 30th, 1694. And the village was finally vacated in 1696 during the Second Pueblo Revolt, where, according to the documents, the inhabitants actually fled to Taos to evade the Spanish army, and then eventually ended up back in Pojoaque and Tesuque. Fred Wendorf did some excavations at Kuyamuge in 1952, and we have also, again, been looking at the material from that work as part of our project. Okay, here's a map of the village of Kuyamuge. Again, you can see the base map is from the unmanned aerial vehicle, and you can see all of the outlines of the rooms outlined in red. Those are the actual locations of the outlines of the rooms. Something that, a real blessing that our project experienced was that the very first year we started working together, the first thing that we did was fly a drone over Kuyamuge to create this topographic map. And you'll see a section of the orthophoto that we created using the drone on the left side here. And if you look carefully, you can actually see outlines of the rooms in the patterns of the plant growth on the slide. So here I'll highlight it for you so you can see how we could actually draw the edges of all of the walls just using the orthophoto. So here it is. You can probably see the outlines there. And when you zoom in, it's really quite remarkable. At times you can see both faces of the walls, and sometimes you can even see how the walls were put together by looking carefully at the plant growth patterns. We could not see this on the ground, but we could see it very clearly in the orthophoto. So that's how we got all of the rooms of the Pueblo to show up on the map so beautifully. And you'll see a 3D model that we created of the site later in the presentation that builds from this information. As part of our work, we also tabulated potsherds in all the spots on the map here that you see the black circles. So a number of locations all around the village. And you can see the output of the computer program when we feed all this information into it. Looks like this village was first established around 1200 and again was inhabited until about 1700, as the Spanish document suggests. You can see that the village reached its maximum population probably in the latter half of the 1300s. Well, what I want to do is share with you some things we've learned about the history of this village from studying the distributions of different kinds of pottery across the site. But before I do that, I think it's important to get a feel for the way Tewa people talk about their history and how their communities came together in the distant past. And this is a summary of what a number of different community members have shared with me, and also of published accounts of the Tewa origin narrative. And I have this in plural here because every version is a little bit different, and so in presenting this summary, I'm not at all suggesting that this is a canonical version of the story, for example. They do vary from place to place, and I'll actually mention a few ways in which that's true as we go through the talk. So the way most versions of the narrative proceed is they begin by discussing how the ancestors of today's Tewa people dwelled in a place in the distant north, and that at a certain point they started thinking about leaving that ancestral homeland and coming south to the place where Tewa people live today. And when that event finally took place, the people came down the Rio Grande in two groups. The people who came down on the east side of the Rio Grande are referred to as the winter people, and the people who came down on the west side are referred to as the summer people. In some versions of the story, there are little episodes that suggest that the winter people led the way. In one version of the story, there's an episode where the summer chief tried to come out and leave the ancestral homeland, but the ground was too muddy and it was hard to walk on. So the winter chief came out first and froze the ground to make it easier for the people to walk, and so that the winter people went first and then the summer people followed behind. In these stories, initially, each group, the summer people and the winter people, built separate villages on their journey to the south, And then after a time, they came back together to create Tewa communities that have summer people and winter people in them. Well, what I want to do now is show you a little bit about the history of Kuyamuge that I think illustrates some aspects of this story. What you're going to see here is a map of the buildings, and also you can see some blue blobs of different shades of blue. The deeper the shade of blue, the more dense the pottery of a certain age is at the site. So, for example, in this slide right here, this is the distribution of pottery that dates between about 1200 and 1250 at the site. And if you look at it here, you can see that the area where this kind of pottery is most dense is in the southeastern portion of the village, in this area where there are a number of small, family-sized adobe mounds. And that little section of this village looks like it's the oldest part. Its layout is pretty similar to the Pojoaque Grant site that I mentioned earlier, that was a larger village in earlier centuries. But the initial community at Kuyamuge seems to have been this area in the southeast there. Later on in the 1200s, what occurred is that the center of the community on the southern mesa here moved a little bit northward to this larger room block at the north end of the southern mesa. And a second village was built on this northern mesita. That's that roughly C-shaped pueblo with an opening to the south, 2 kivas, and a plaza in the center. This is the period of time when a variety of evidence suggests that there were a lot of people migrating into the northern Rio Grande from the Four Corners country. Perhaps you might think about this as being the arrival of the summer people, making a separate village from the winter people who had arrived earlier. So if you step back here, you could think about this initial area of Kuyamuge being enshrined in memory as the home of the winter people, and then this second village here in the north being enshrined in memory as a home of the summer people. By about 100 years after the arrival of the summer people on that northern mesita, those 2 villages appear to have coalesced into a single village, again back in the southern mesa, and you can see the hot spot for pottery of this period from roughly 1350 to 1450 here. It's centered on this large plaza at the south end of the village, or the southeastern edge of the village. And I think the occupation included this area on the southeast side, adjacent to those older mounds that were no longer inhabited. So by this point, Kuyamuge took the form of a paired plaza village that had a larger village on the west side and a smaller plaza on the east side. This seems to be is quite resonant with the idea of the summer and the winter people having arrived separately, built separate villages that then over time coalesced into a single village. Perhaps the summer plaza was on the west and the winter plaza on the east. And finally, during the 17th century, when the Spaniards had come into northern New Mexico, the village coalesced even further into just this original, oldest central area of the southern mesa, where those 2 large and thick room blocks there were the focus of occupation. And those are the room blocks where Fred Wendorf did his excavations in 1952. So Wendorf's work actually just deals with the final century of the history of a community that has a much deeper history than that. So from looking at the distribution of pottery with respect to the arrangement of the buildings at Kuyamuge, something that strikes me is that this particular village also shows connections between the communities that existed here in the past and people from other parts of the world who at a certain point came to the Pojoaque area and became a part of the Pueblo communities of the Pojoaque region. All right, the second aspect of our findings that strikes me as being pretty interesting and resonant is the idea of cycles. If you spend time with Pojoaque people, an event that is very important to them is the period in the early 20th century when the community was forced to disperse from Pojoaque. And there was a period of time where it wasn't clear whether the community would continue. But in 1934, I believe 5 or 6 families resettled, Pojoaque families resettled the Pueblo. and put down roots again, replanted themselves there, and almost a century later now there are about 500 members of the Pueblo. So the community has grown from that small beginning, and from a point where the community in the late 19th century had been forced to disperse due to the pressures that they were facing at the time. Something that strikes me from our work is that this episode that is so important to community members today is something that's actually happened several times over the history of the Pueblo. To get into this, I want to talk a little bit about the Pueblo of Pojoaque itself, and this is the proper way of saying it in Tewa, Pojoaque. Its translation is something like the water drinking or water gathering place. It seems to refer to the region of springs that occurs where the Tesuque and Pojoaque rivers come together, right below the Pueblo today. I'll show you that the village of Pojoaque was also established around 900 AD. And in some versions of Tewa traditional history, there's a place within, near the Pueblo of Pojoaque called Teke Oing, which is referred to in the stories as a place where Tewa ancestors gathered together before dispersing to the different four corners of the Tewa world. So that by itself is a clue that this idea of coming together and dispersing has happened more than once. The people of Pojoaque participated in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. During that period of time, the community was forced to disperse, but it was resettled in 1706 after the Troubles ended by a small number of families. Again, I mentioned the case where the village dispersed and resettled in 1934 again. I'm not sure exactly what the history behind this is. I'm sure there's an interesting story, but it seems like all of these major sites in the Pojoaque area were excavated in 1952, and the Pueblo of Pojoaque is another example. Florence Hawley Ellis did a project for the Pueblo in 1952 and did some excavations there. I'll be talking about her results in a moment. This is an image of the information we've been able to document in the Pueblo of Pojoaque itself. We've been able to fly a portion of the village area with a UAV. This is, of course, focusing on the land that is not built on today. There are residences in other areas of the present-day Pueblo that are not shown, that are blank on the map, there's just topography showing. And then there are several other areas that you can see where students and community members and I have documented ancestral sites and surface pottery remains and things like that. What I want to do, first of all, is focus on these two areas here, the one in the west and another one on the east. You can see these two areas, concentrations of mounds, kivas, and artifacts. Here's several of these history plots I've been talking about. The one at the top is the one we've seen before. It's the history of occupation of the Pojoaque Grant site. The one graph in the middle is the results for what we refer to as the Romero site at Pojoaque. This is the area to the west that I highlighted in the previous slide. And what you can see there is that in this part of the village, again, it was established around in the 900s, around the same time as the Pojoaque Grant site, but that it grew pretty substantially as the Pojoaque Grant site population declined. So perhaps some of the people that lived at the Pojoaque Grant site actually moved to Pojoaque in the 1200s, or maybe the 1100s, the late 1100s. And then finally, the bottom slide is from an area that community members refer to today as the Winter Village, which is at the east edge of the Pueblo. And you can see that in this area, the population or the settlement there grew pretty substantially in the 1200s and through the 1300s. Now, this is also the area that some anthropologists that worked with Pueblo people about 100 years ago located and gave the name Teke Oing to. So the story about the place where Pueblo people came together before dispersing to the four directions is associated with this region of the Pojoaque Pueblo today, where it looks as though there was actually people moving in during the 1200s and 1300s when people were coming into the Pojoaque area from the north. So here again you can see connections between the Pueblo and people from other parts of the world. But you can also see the community growing in different areas of the present-day Pueblo over time. What I want to do now is show you, talk to you about some information from two other regions of the present-day Pueblo. One is called the Garcia site. This is an area that was excavated by Florence Ellis in 1952. You can see here that this portion of the village didn't get going until the mid to late 1200s, but it grew very strongly in the 1300s, as did the winter village. And then you can see that its population declined a little bit through the 1400s and 1500s. During the 1600s, it spiked up again, and then the population seems to have vacated once again during the Pueblo Revolt period, or in the immediate aftermath of the Pueblo Revolt. And then there was additional life in that area in the 1700s and 1800s. Here again, you can see these cycles of people moving in and moving away and coming back and going away, happening several times over the centuries. And this is the area of the old Pueblito, the area of Pojoaque that was inhabited between about 1700 and 1900. And you can see the pottery assemblage from this area. That little blip in the 17th century shows up in this portion of the village, but then the main occupation there was from about 1750 to 1900. So if you put all of this, well, I want to mention one other thing before putting it all together. One of the things we noticed from looking at the collections from Ellis's excavations, which are shown here in purple on the map, you can see the outlines of the two areas that she excavated, is we found a number of pieces of pottery that were made with a distinctive glaze paint that date from the 1600s primarily, late 1500s, 1600s. And we can put them into two time slices. They're referred to as glaze E and glaze F. And what we've done is we've looked at them carefully under the microscope to determine the raw materials that these pieces were made from. And one thing that we found is that, for example, these glaze painted sherds dating from 1515 to 1650 are primarily include kinds of rock that are found in the Galisteo Basin. And so they probably were made by potters that lived in the Galisteo Basin pueblos, the area that Tewa people refer to as the Tano area today. But then during the glaze F period in the middle 1600s to 1700, what you can see is that the vast majority of these pieces were made with the kinds of rock that you find right in the Pojoaque area today. But yet this was a kind of pottery whose style originated in the Galisteo Basin pueblos. So perhaps this little blip here of the growth of the population of Pojoaque during the 1600s is from Tano people whose ancestors had lived in Pojoaque, who had moved down to the Galisteo Basin perhaps around 1400 or so, coming back to the village when times got tough. So again, examples of cycles of dispersal and coming back together. So here's a summary of what we know so far about the population history of the Pueblo of Pojoaque itself. And I've marked some of these key events that I see in the data here. So people perhaps coming from the Pojoaque Grant site, LA 835, during the 1000s. More people moving in from the north and creating the winter village in the 1200s and 1300s. A dispersal of people from the Pojoaque area, as described in the stories related to Kuyamuge in the 1400s. Perhaps some Tano people coming home again during the 1600s, the era of Spanish colonization. Dispersal during the Pueblo Revolt and Reconquest era. And then a regathering into the old Pueblito in the 1700s and 1800s. Again, a dispersal at the end of the 1800s, and the final regathering off of the slide here in 1934. So I think you can see here that it's just this amazingly cyclical history of the Pueblo. Some of you may have watched the sci-fi series Battlestar Galactica. It's something that I really liked watching when it came out. One of the famous lines from that series is, "Everything has happened before and will happen again." And the history of the Pueblo of Pojoaque seems to reflect that too. All right, the third thing we've learned, continuities and changes. This is an image of the famous Pojoaque potter Glenn Gomez sharing his knowledge about pottery making with a group of field school students here. To discuss continuities and changes, there's a key issue that I think archaeologists and scholars of Spanish colonialism need to deal with and need to address. The key issue here is that in any living tradition, in any living society, traditions change over time. People run into other people, they encounter new people, they encounter new ideas. Some of them they find to be useful and exciting, and others they don't. And people incorporate those things that they find useful and interesting into their way of life as they encounter them. The elements of the tradition of any people, each of the pieces of it that might together comprise a tradition at any given moment, each have their own history. So if you think about, for example, the various elements of what we call American Christmas, it's some combination of, some reindeer herding shaman from Finland, perhaps, somewhere up in the subarctic of Europe, northern Europe, with a baby born in Palestine at some other time. And it includes these evergreen trees with lights and ornaments on them that are probably, again, related to Northern European traditions. If you track each of the elements of the things that Americans do to celebrate Christmas, you'll see that it takes you to the four corners of the earth and a variety of different peoples and times and places. But yet, in all of our families today, we consider Christmas to be, one of the most traditional things that we do. The point is that there's no historical reality to that tradition. The tradition is something that comes together at any given moment. And this is true for Pueblo people too, and for Pueblo tradition as well. Pojoaque people and other Pueblo people have incorporated things from many different peoples over the centuries. If you take the broad view, the domesticated crops that Pueblo people grow were first domesticated way to the south of here in Mexico. The moccasins that Tewa people wear today were not a part of the tradition of their ancestors of the Four Corners country. They were adopted by Pueblo people through their interactions with Plains people in the Rio Grande region. Some of the dances that Pueblo people do today seem to have more in common with the traditions of Plains people than with other southwestern peoples. And you might even consider that the language that Pueblos speak today will have changed over the centuries. Pojoaque ancestors may not have always spoken the Tewa language. They could have spoken other languages and adopted the Tewa language at a certain point in their history. The point is that all of this continued after the Spaniards arrived and became a part of Pueblo life, and it continues today. And these kinds of changes in tradition should not be construed as loss or acculturation. It should be construed of as life. And so for a community to have life, it needs to be allowed to incorporate things from the larger world that it finds to be of value. And I think it is it's an error for non-native scholars to view that process as something like acculturation or loss. So let's think about some of the ways that Pueblo life changed during the 17th century, and think about it not from the point of view of acculturation, but from the point of view of Pueblo people continuing a social process that has been a part of their tradition for many millennia. This is a map of Kuyamuge that shows the surrounding field areas that we have documented through our work. So there's all these little garden plots. The brown areas are areas covered in a gravel mulch that the emerging pollen evidence suggests is a technology that's geared toward producing cotton for making clothing. Well, as I mentioned before, Fred Wendorf excavated in the historic 17th century portion of Kuyamuge, and he recovered a number of animal bones from the excavations. This is a tabulation of the species of animal, or the major categories of mammals that were found in this collection of faunal remains. And I've highlighted at the bottom a number of species that were introduced to Pueblo people by the Spaniards. So you can see cattle, pigs, horses, mules, sheep, and goats. All of these are species that Pueblo people began to take care of once the Spaniards introduced them into their lives. And something that's very interesting that we've noticed is in all of these field areas surrounding Kuyamuge, we do not find much 17th century pottery. We find lots of pottery dating from pre-Spanish times, but we don't find much of what we call Tewa polychrome, the red, white, and black pottery dating from the 17th century in these field areas. So it seems as though the people of Kuyamuge put less energy into using these field areas to produce cotton for their clothing in the 17th century. But one thing they did put more energy into, apparently, is taking care of sheep and goats that, of course, produce wool, which was an alternative way of getting the fiber that you need to make clothing. And we found some additional evidence of this at this site here, where the little blue area is a spring. These long black things are actually trails that we found. The one on the right goes toward Kuyamuge. The one on the upper right goes toward Pojoaque. The one going a little bit to the northwest goes toward Sakona, another Tewa village. And you can see a couple of rooms, and there's some pottery pieces. There's some juniper trees that have been cut with a metal axe in the area too. The pottery of this village dates to the same period of time when the people of Kuyamuge were adopting all of these domestic animals and seem to have stopped growing as much cotton for their clothing. So this is another example of, it's probably a site where Pojoaque ancestors kept herds of livestock away from the village and the fields where the crops were growing, of course. This is a nice grassy area today that I think would have been pretty good for grazing animals in the past. Well, Pueblo people also, another thing Pueblo people adopted from the Spaniards is wheat. If you go to a Pueblo feast today, in almost any village, wheat bread cooked in an horno will be one of the main side dishes that is served. This bread is made from dough, of course. It's mixed in these beautiful large dough bowls. You can see an image of one here from the 18th century. And they're cooked in these clay ovens here. Well, something that's pretty interesting to look at is the way in which these new Spanish things were incorporated into the Tewa language. So I have a table here on the right of the slide that shows you words for things introduced by the Spaniards. And if you just look at the table, so wafer bread, buwa, something like bowl wipe would be a etymology of that or a translation of it. Buwaku is a kamale, let's say, or a wafer bread stone. Buwate would be the oven, or te is the word for house in Tewa. So buwate would be the oven in which you would cook wafer bread. Here's the word for wheat, tata, grass seed. Or the word for bread is from Spanish, pan. The word for oven is pante, so it's the Spanish bread house, the place where bread is cooked. The word for dough seems to be a Tewa word, owa, not masa, for example. Oase is the word for yeast, not like Spanish. The word for dough bowl, the word for threshing floor, it looks like it's from Spanish. But there's also a Tewa word for an irrigation ditch that seems to be a translation of the acequia madre. So much of the language of the new things that the Spaniards introduced to the Pueblos was incorporated into their culture using native language words. And my collaborator David Shaw and I have done a larger study of this, and what we found is that almost 75% of the new things introduced by the Spaniards to Pueblo culture were incorporated into Pueblo languages using native language terms rather than Spanish terms. I think this is a good sign that, again, during the 17th and 18th centuries, Pueblo people incorporated things that the Spaniards introduced to their life into their own way of being, into their own culture. We found some evidence for the adoption of wheat or the uptake of wheat in the Pueblo economy in our reanalysis of the collections from the Garcia site and the old Pueblito. This chart here shows you the percentages of sherds from different kinds of vessels that we found in this collection. And I want to draw your attention to the plain jar column, where you can see that the Garcia site's a little bit older, and the old Pueblito is primarily 18th century. So between the 17th and the 18th century, you can see that the fraction of the pottery that is coming from these plain storage jars almost doubled. And if you look at the one thing we've done is we've measured the thicknesses of those pieces from the storage jars. So the blue is the distribution of the thicknesses of those vessels from the Garcia site, and then the red is the distribution from the larger collection from the old Pueblito. You can see that the average size, the average thickness of the jars got a lot thicker in the 18th century. I suspect this is because these vessels are a lot larger, and they're probably designed for storing wheat that was used for making bread. All right, my final thought is about place and belonging. This is an image of the Pueblo today at sunset looking west. There's a very famous anthropologist named Keith Basso who wrote a famous book called Wisdom Sits in Places. And it's about how the traditions and the place lore of Native people are localized and fixed in particular spots, so that when community members encounter those places, they are reminded of the stories and of the knowledge that they maintain. What you might say based on our work is that history sits in places for Pojoaque people. I have a representation of that history of Kuyamuge here on the right side of the slide. We can walk through it and look at it in a different way. You have the early village on the upper right, where there was a number of family-sized residences there on the east edge of the mesa. Then you have the era where there were paired villages there, and those initial residences were vacated. Then you have the era in the lower left, where those two villages coalesced into a dual plaza village with summer people and winter people. Well, what I want to draw your attention to here is that if you look at this and imagine yourself being someone who lived in Kuyamuge in the 1400s, you could have walked around your land and seen the physical traces of those paired villages that were recounted in story right there, right next to your village where you live now. It would be a very resonant and present reminder of that history, and it almost certainly would have helped the people who lived at Kuyamuge to remember their history. And of course, this continues today. Pueblo people who visit ancestral sites learn many things from them, learn many lessons from their ancestors by observing the details of history that are present on the surfaces of these places. This is another area where I think what we can talk about is, why is it that Pojoaque people and other tribal communities are so attached to the places that they call home? And why is the opportunity to remain attached to those places so important to them? This quote here is from the Bears Ears Tribal Coalition. It's one of their phrases that they use to describe the importance of the Bears Ears area, the Bears Ears National Monument, to Native people in the Southwest. We belong to the land. Think about that phrase for a second. First of all, it's we, not I. It's a group. Second, it's belong. It's not own, control, a guest. You belong to it. The land owns you rather than you owning the land. And then it's the land. It's a very broad term that describes all sorts of things. The land and its people, the plants, the animals, the weather, the wind, the clouds. I want to draw your attention to how different the Pueblo way of thinking about attachment to place and about the Pueblo itself and about the settlement is from the tradition of thought in the Western world. I have some language from ancient Greek regarding where the word for city in ancient Greek comes from. It comes from the word talis, for a stronghold or a citadel, became the word for city. And of course, today, our words for things like politician and politics come from this term. Originally, it had to do with the place that a group of people go to protect themselves from other people. Below that, you can see some terms from Latin. How did the Romans think about the city? The word civis in Latin means a member of a community, a member of the community. And it became then, later in time, the word for city. So when we think of a citizen today, it comes from this way of thinking. Right? So in both of these ways of thinking, the group of people themselves are the key. The group of people themselves are the key element of a settlement or a community. Here is some Tewa language that discusses, gives you a hint as to the way Tewa people and other native communities view a settlement or a place where people live. The word for village, owinge, seems to have embedded in it the verb winu, which is something like to stand or grow upright in a place. It's applied to the growing corn plants and to the dancers who are prepared to perform in the dances. The word for plaza, pinge, derives from an older word for heart or middle. You could think of the beat of the drums in the plaza during ceremonies. The heart of the community as a whole. Actually, not just of the people, but of the surrounding land as well. You could think about the shrines in the center of the village, Nansipu, as an earth navel, describing the spot of connection between the people and their mother, the earth. And then you can think about the word for kiva, te'e, which roughly translates as a special house, derives from a word for a cottonwood tree, something that grows out of the ground where there's water below the surface. All of these things invoke the imagery of the natural world and especially of plants, and connects people to non-human things. It's really very different from the Western tradition in thinking about a sense of belonging to a place. So place in Pueblo culture and in other native cultures is primary. The knowledge that people have that help them to make a living, to survive and thrive is local. There's an image here of the summer solstice sunrise from Kuyamuge. Someone had to spend time at that spot every day to get to know where the sun came up every year so that they could tell time and know how to organize the calendar of events for the success of the community. The people in a village are part of the environment. They're not separate from it. They are, you might say, the place with its people rather than the place and its people, or the place or its people. It's the place with. And something that's really occurred to me in spending time in Pueblo communities is how important being there and being present and taking part in community events is. You know, when Pueblos hold a feast, if you arrive and participate in the event, you're given a gift of food because you're there, because the place is the most important thing. Who you are and where you come from is not as important as the fact that you are there to take part in this prayer for blessings. And something that strikes me is that this way of thinking has actually gotten more important over time in Pueblo culture. One line of evidence that strikes me about this, it has to do with the built environment of Kuyamuge over time. This is a 3D model you can see here of what the village looked like during that paired village era in the early 1300s. This is looking south. But here's an image of a summary of the environment of Kuyamuge over time. The blue bars show you the amount of square meters of plaza space per room in the village. You can see that from the 1300s into the 1400s, it increased from about 5 to about 30 square meters per person. In other words, there was a lot more room for visitors who did not live at Kuyamuge to come to the community events that they threw for the benefit, not just, the benefit of the place, and not just for the people who lived there, but for the benefit of all. You can also see the red bar, which is the average size of the rooms that occurred in Kuyamuge over time. And this is also pretty interesting, that the sizes of the rooms got larger over the centuries. It's as though people's houses got bigger, as though perhaps this way of being generous with people and not being so concerned about lineage or blood, for example, led to benefits for the community, at least larger houses. This discussion leads us to thinking about some of the deeper ideas about the ways Pueblo people, as far as I can tell, think about the land and the role of people in the land. And I struggle with the right language to express this in English, but I would, the main thing I would say is that I've definitely experienced a way of thinking that involves the unity of nature and culture. One of the first things that archaeologists learn when they're just going into the field is how to tell the difference between something that is natural and something that is, quote, cultural, an artifact versus an eco-fact. What I found is that distinction is not that important to Pueblo people in visiting ancestral sites. One good example of this is the idea of the fetish. Many of us have purchased perhaps fetishes from a arts and crafts dealer or something like that over the years. The way Pueblo people think about fetishes is that they begin as a rock that already has the spirit of the animal that it ends up becoming when a person picks it up and finishes it off. So these are some examples of fetishes that community members identified as we did our work at Kuyamuge. The one at the top is an eagle, and the one at the bottom is a bear. The spirit of those animals was already in the rock when we found them. And tribal members, community members who worked with us in the field took these kinds of objects as a sign that this was a good place to be, a place where the spirits of these animals were present to help the people who dwelled properly in this environment. So human action merely finishes something that Mother Nature has mostly done already for you. A human being did not make that rock that looks like the eagle or like the bear. Nature did that. And the human role is simply to complete what nature has started. You might say that, Pueblo people view their land with an idea of emergent spirit, the idea that the playing out of all of these ultimately, stochastic, random processes that we call nature, that we call evolution, at the scale of the land, leads to an emergent kind of spirit that is very parallel to the kind of spirit that an animate human being has in their thoughts and actions. And so, something that's pretty interesting is that, what I found is that Pueblo people don't make a very strong distinction between artifacts and ecofacts. They think of all those sorts of things, all of those sorts of results of past action by the spirits, by Mother Nature, or by people as chaye, a term sometimes loosely translated as shrine. But I think, the idea of thinking about spirit, the kind of spirit and soul we think of as being a part of human consciousness, as being a part of the world itself, is something that has really come home to me. And I think, if you imagine dwelling in that way in this land, I think you can begin to get a feel for why Pueblo people are so attached to their places. And if you take it farther, it leads to a distinctive way of thinking about the relationship between the human community and the larger world. And the way I would think about it is that the purpose of the human community is to help Mother Nature to do what it does. It's not really control in the sense that, we often think of Western technology or Western science as something that creates control over the forces of nature. It's not that. It's also not the Western idea of wilderness, the idea of leaving nature alone and ignoring it on the presumption that it will do just fine without us. It more says that nature needs us, in a sense, to help it. So the best image I can come up with from my experiences is to think about the relationship between people and nature as analogous to the way a child would care for their mother. The mother behaves altruistically, gives without concern for reciprocation to their children. And a child's role is to not control, not to ignore, but to care for their mother. The final thing I want to say about the nature of attachment and belonging to place in Pueblo communities is a phrase that is often shared with CU students when they visit tribal communities for tribal events, for feast day and things like that. The whole thing is a prayer. And the idea there is that everything that occurs in a Pueblo event is a form of prayer, in the sense that it is encouraging the world that we want through our efforts and behavior, encouraging generosity, encouraging kindness, encouraging the human community to care for their mother in the way they care for the earth. In these events, of course, Pueblo people receive guidance from the ancestors. The traditions help them to know how to bring about this desired world. And something that has also been, shared with me many times by Pueblo people that have talked about their traditions with me is that when these prayers occur, they are not for the people themselves. They're not for just a family or just a Pueblo. They are for everyone. They are for the plants, the animals, the clouds, the rain, the land, and the people. The prayers that are a part of Pueblo life, as you can see, don't make the distinctions and divisions and classifications that are typical of Western culture. The prayers are for all the world, and that includes all the people in it. So if you think about it from this point of view of The purpose of human action is to encourage a world that we all want. Actually, from working with community members, I've come to see that archaeology can be a part of that process. And in a sense, then archaeology is a part of that prayer. It's a way of learning from the ancestors, integrating that, combining it with the traditions of present-day community members to help us learn from them in ways that can make our world a better place than it is now for the future. So these are the kinds of things that I'm hoping to continue working with Pojoaque community members over the coming year. As I've said, these are my thoughts or my own reactions to the things that I've learned from working with them. I would not pretend that they are anything beyond my own. But I am hoping that, as part of this project, community members will be able to share their voices or add their voices to the thoughts that I have in presenting the work that we've done together to a larger world in the hope of achieving this sort of outcome. So I'd like to thank, there's many people that are important to thank for the work that we're doing together. First and foremost, of course, the Pueblo of Pojoaque. The Kuyamuge Institute, whose land on which Kuyamuge sits, has been very generous in allowing us to work there. The Continuing Pathways Foundation, the Department of Anthropology, the Office of Outreach and Engagement at CU, the National Science Foundation, and SAR have all provided financial support to this work. I've also benefited from a group of local volunteers from the Indian Peaks chapter of the Colorado Archaeological Society, who has spent many years helping us to reanalyze the collections from the museums. And then I've had several dozen CU students, undergraduates and graduates, have helped us in the field, and many Tewa friends and many villages have as well. Thank you to everyone who's been a part of this project. I hope I am representing it well for all of you, and I apologize for any areas where I have not. And I hope you'll add your voices to the way we think about what we're doing together. Thank you.